Hello and welcome to the Reserve Funding Analyzer. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how you can perform the most important element of a reserve study, which is the physical analysis and inventory. So I call this the DIY, Physical Analysis and Inventory. My name is Steve Beisel. I developed the Reserve Funding Analyzer, which is an application for developing a funding plan for a homeowner association. I developed the RFA for our homeowner association so we could analyze our reserve funding and develop a sound funding plan for implementation. The RFA provides the means for you to develop a sound reserve funding plan for your own HOA, even if you are not a financial analyst. In this video, I will be showing you how to perform your own reserve component physical analysis and inventory, which is the most important part of a reserve study. Now, every reserve study has two parts: the physical analysis of the reserve components, which include such things as the identification, of course, descriptive information such as the quantity, the condition of the asset, its useful and remaining life, when it was placed into service, and what is an estimate of the repair or replacement cost. The second part of a reserve study is a financial analysis and funding plan, and the primary prerequisite for the funding plan is that you have a physical analysis, but it also requires financial data such as what your current reserve balance, your annual operational expenses, what sources of income do you have, and what kind of ability do you have to adjust the amount of income, for example, increasing annual dues. And you also have to have some financial assumptions or hard data, such as earned interest rate for the reserve fund balance and the annual inflation rate. To begin, you need to identify who is responsible for all of the reserve components. Now, when I say responsible, I don't mean the actual person. I mean, is it your association? For example, your CC&Rs or association rules of engagement or documents should clearly define the division of maintenance and replacement responsibilities. The actual items in the various categories will vary according to your own plan and governing documents. The physical analysis is the first step, as I said earlier, to a reserve study. And what is the physical analysis? And I mentioned earlier it's information about the status, the component inventory's condition, age, and cost. The component inventory should remain relatively stable from year to year, while the condition and the evaluation, cost to replace, and things like that are going to clearly change from year to year. The second part of the reserve study is a financial analysis and funding plan, and it is made up by determining the current reserve fund strength and developing a recommendation for the appropriate reserve contribution rate, also known as the funding plan. So here are the steps for the creation of a physical analysis. The first is quite obvious: identify the components. Then specify the quantities. Inspect those components so you can have a methodology for inspection and what is the scope. What is the useful life and determine any maintenance assumptions. Assess the remaining life and determine the replacement year, and then determine the cost of replacement. Now, the criteria for these components: the item typically has to be the responsibility of the association, not the responsibility of individual homeowners. Secondly, item cost over a certain amount have to be determined. Typically, in most homeowner association, this is around $1,000, but it could be more or less. That's your choice. And the estimated useful life for all of these items is predictable, and typically they're greater than 1 year. If the useful life is 1 year or less, they then become really part of the operational cost. So developing a list of components is time-consuming, and it really is nothing more than an inventory. Now, that inventory, we call it the component inventory. Your community document should describe the common areas, and this will help you develop a list of all of the components. And your developer, if you are a new development, should have a reserve budget, and it should list the components that the builder identified while planning the project. You should also seek the counsel of knowledgeable people such as services providers. You can use previous reserve study data, and this is because the list of components is not likely to change. And lastly, you can check with local governments and utilities because they will also be able to provide for you where their responsibilities end and the responsibilities of the association begins. When you're looking at the quantity and constituent parts, you need to look at the unit of measure. It might be square feet or linear feet. Sometimes it might be defined by weight, or they might be defined as units, or you might refer to them as each. And look at the quality and specification. Here's some examples. Is the roof a 2-ply roof? Is the asphalt 2 inches thick or 4 inches thick? What grade of paint? Things like that. When you're looking at the useful life, this is a little tough, but the warranty of the component may provide some guidance. You can also look at published guidelines. You can consult product experts such as service providers and vendors, but you need to take into account environmental conditions and the remaining life. As you examine the useful life, then you're also trying to determine what is the overall condition of that component. So you have to come up with an idea of how long is this component going to remain in good condition. Perform that physical inspection, consult experts, look at past maintenance records, and you have to have maybe preventative maintenance. Your prior reserve study should have many of these details. Determining the cost of replacement, well, the manufacturer or their representatives, local contractors, and you need to also remember to include the cost of removing existing components. When you create your inventory list, you need to then include it in the RFA, or the Reserve Funding Analyzer. Now, one part of the RFA includes a sheet called the Reserve Component Useful Life. This is a pictorial of that sheet. You can use this sheet. It has a couple hundred typical components, and you can go through the sheet and you can click on yes to include this inventory, include the component into your inventory by using the fields that I show here and then clicking on the button called Add Marked Items to the Inventory. And once you click on that button, all of those items that you have marked will be included. Kind of a quick way to get those items right into your reserve items and special project sheet. An ideal source to help create an inventory can be found in a prior reserve study. If you have a prior reserve study, it will list all the component details, including description, quantity, useful and remaining life, and the estimated cost for replacement or maintenance. And here I'm showing you an actual reserve study with some reserve component list details. Now this is a pictorial of the sheet in the RFA, and you would transcribe the data from your inventory list into the RFA. And as you can see here, I've included things like the category, the component name, the cost, what year was it placed into service, and the estimated useful life. The fields that you see here in gray are calculated fields, so that would include the remaining useful life in the next year of service. And you can see I included the quantity. And for example, looking at the first one, there's 35,500 square feet of asphalt that would need replacement every 20 years. And it was placed into service in 2004. So it then requires the replacement in 2024. So it has a total remaining useful life of 5 years. Now, in a previous video, I explained how to include or exclude these components as part of your analysis. And then the cost basis, typically you use current estimate, but you might have actual cost data when the product or when the component was actually replaced. So you need to choose the appropriate option. The other things that you should include before you do anything else is to include the current year and put in an assumed inflation rate. You can see in this illustration here. Once you've transcribed all of that component information into the RFA, the full funding requirements will instantly be created. You'll have a detailed summary sheet that you see here. You'll have a maintenance schedule that will be created. and you will have expenditure graphs that will be created showing you pictorially what expenditures you will have in the year that they will occur. And it will automatically apply inflation to all of your reserve components. Once you get that done, you can complete the funding plan by entering the remaining relevant data. And that data includes the reserve balance and the income, for example, current annual dues and operational expenses. It includes what kind of annual dues increases you would anticipate having so that your income will rise to meet your expenses. And as you are entering that data, you will be able to observe the financial summary instantly while entering data. That concludes this video for the DIY of the physical analysis and inventory. There are some other videos in the Reserve Funding Analyzer series. It includes the introduction to the RFA, data entry, funding basics, and how to create the funding plan. Thank you very much for watching.